In this video, I'm going to walk you through how I built this queen size bed, and I do have plans available if you'd like to build it yourself. Let's get into it. I started by working on the 4 legs, which I already had glued together from some smaller boards. You could of course just cut these out of some larger posts if you wanted to. After getting them squared back up, I could go ahead and get them cut down to final height on the miter saw. Then I could start working on the details on the bottom of the legs, first cutting this cove detail with a 3/4 inch round nose bit in my router. I simply clamped a square to the leg as a guide and made a pass on all 4 sides. Clamping a sacrificial piece at the end helps eliminate the wood from tearing out as well. Next I could add the taper, but first I needed to make a quick jig. I just set the table saw fence at a random dimension and then ran a piece of scrap plywood through. Then I could set a leg on the plywood lined up with the edge where I wanted the taper cut. To make the cuts quickly repeatable, I just brad nailed some strips on the 2 inside edges to act as fences. For the clamps I used, I then had to add a couple more blocks to build it up so they'd be close to flush with the legs. You can build some pretty fancy taper jigs, but this one literally took 3 minutes to make and it worked great. Afterwards I can just pop the brad nails off and use it for something else. With the jig done, I could then run it through the table saw, leaving the fence where it was when I initially cut the plywood so it cuts right on that same edge. The cove paired with the taper looks awesome in my opinion. What do you think? After the legs were done, I could start working on the main plywood panels for the headboard and footboard. I cut the pieces to length, but before cutting them into the 2 separate pieces, I went ahead and cut in the groove details. You can of course just use a regular circular saw for all these cuts with the depth set, but the Makita plunge saw has this score cut depth setting, and I find it to be the perfect depth for the grooves like these. I always have just built out of my head and a few numbers scratched on paper, but this is the first project where I made plans for you guys beforehand and actually used the plans myself. It was definitely nice laying these out on the computer and only cutting the necessary grooves for the final look after trim. Once the grooves were done, I then went ahead and cut the 2 panels to final size. Here I'm ripping down some 3/4 inch MDF to size, which would be the first layer of trim detail. I don't usually bore you all with footage of me sanding, but I just wanted to share the sample pack of Mirka sandpaper that I got off Amazon for this project. A lot of influencers seem to push this stuff, so I wanted to go ahead and see how it is. This isn't even their nicest paper they have, but it's legit and it's the best stuff I've used so far and lasts forever. The price for this pack is pretty good too, so I'll go ahead and leave a link below if you want to check it out. To attach the plywood panels to the legs, I'm just using pocket holes and screws. Really, there's no weight bearing on these panels at all since the side rails will be connected right to the legs, so paired with glue this works out great. And as you can see, I'm actually drilling the holes on the show side, so I can then hide them with my trim and they won't even be seen on either side. For everything to line up with the dimensions I was using, I had to offset the panel a 1/4 inch off the back. To do this, I just set a scrap piece of 1/4 inch material underneath to lift it up while I attached it to the legs. Next, I could add glue and get them attached. The headboard is much of the same, but I did go ahead and add an additional stretcher piece towards the bottom of the legs. Then I could start gluing and nailing on the trim pieces. I like to cut my pieces just about a 32nd of an inch long, and then you can see I lift up in the middle to get the ends seated, and then when I release the middle it springs out and makes some perfect tight seams. The top piece is a little wider, so after I add the crown molding, we're left with the same dimension showing as the rest. This is a really easy and approachable way to do this, since MDF and plywood are inherently really stable products, and we don't need to worry about wood movement as much as solid wood. This last piece is a filler strip, so the crown molding can be flush and wrap around the legs. Next, I could add some cove molding on the inside of the MDF strips. I love all the depth these trim pieces give to this build, and it's a nice change up compared to everything I've been building lately. To finish it off was the crown molding around the top. I personally like to cut my crown nested on the miter saw. And to do this, you just have to wrap your head around the fact that you're cutting your pieces upside down and backwards. Once you get that in your mind, it's really not that bad. Just like trimming a house, I like to pre-assemble my pieces with glue. CA glue works really well on MDF. You just add glue to one piece, spray the other with activator, and then hold the pieces tight until the glue dries within a few seconds. The wood itself will break before these miters ever separate. With the whole crown assembly made up, I then added it to the panels. Since I didn't have my top cap on yet, I'm just using a speed square to make sure it's flush with the top and nailing it on. To connect the headboard and footboard, we need some rails. So here I'm ripping down some poplar to width on the table saw and then final length on the miter saw. Then I attach some 1x2 poplar on the inside bottom edge, and these are what the mattress cross slats rest on. For the hardware, I picked up these Rockler non-mortise bed rail connectors off Amazon. You just attach a bracket to each end of the rails and then the mating bracket onto the headboard and footboard legs. I'm really happy with this product. They were quick to install, and believe me, this bed is solid. No creaking or moving whatsoever. You can see how perfect the rails end up tight against the legs. With those connected, next I cut all the mattress supports to length and pre-drilled all the screw locations. I also added some 2x2 legs to the slats to prevent any sagging at all. Lastly was to prep the top caps, which I used ash for. I'd be finishing these separate from the panels, so to attach them afterwards I just used dowels and glue. These holes didn't have to be in any precise location, because after I had them drilled, I used these dowel center points to find where I needed to drill the corresponding holes in the top caps. Then it was on to a bunch of nail hole filling. One thing I don't like about MDF is how it mushrooms up when you nail it, so you do have to go through and sand them down first, but then after some filler and paint they disappear flawlessly. I set up a makeshift spray booth in my garage and stood the panels up so I could finish both sides at the same time. I didn't give myself much room for the camera, so sorry for all the bad angles. But I sprayed 2 coats of Zinzer bin shellac primer with my Graco 9.5 HVLP. Sanding in between coats with 220 grit. Spraying white on top of white is pretty lame on video, and the camera was in my way to be honest anyway, so after the primer I sprayed 2 coats of General Finishes white poly for a super durable finish. For the top caps I used General Finishes gray gel stain. The best way I've found to apply this stain is to first do a slip coat of mineral spirits and then apply the gel stain while it's still wet. Then you can lightly wipe off the excess and it glides a lot easier without getting all gummy and blotchy. After the stain dried, I simply wiped on 2 coats of shellac and buffed out the sheen with some double-aught steel wool for that nice satin finish. Once everything had dried, I could reinstall all the hardware and get this thing finished up. Finishing the caps a separate color did add some more work and time to the build, but I love how it turned out. You could of course just nail the cap on or use screws and then plug the holes and finish it all together. But the dowel method worked out great, and the jigs are pretty cheap if you don't already have one. Really, you don't even need a jig, you just need to make sure you're drilling the holes straight and use some of those center points. I didn't apply too much clamping pressure so it wouldn't mess up the finish, just enough to make it flush and hold it for the glue to dry. But any imperfections that there were, I could simply buff them out with the steel wool again. All right, thanks for watching. Hopefully you were entertained or learned something. And if you're not, make sure you're subscribed. I got a couple more videos coming for this bedroom suite. So until next time, take care.